Before the tier opened, Stephen Strange was already losing. He would not have called it that, not out loud, not even in the privacy of his own skull. Sorcerer Supreme did not lose. Sorcerer Supreme adapted. That was the whole of the job description scrawled somewhere beneath the older and grander titles. But the truth of the sanctum's east wall, cracking under a convergence of 3 collapsing ley lines from a rupture in the Congo that a lesser sorcerer had opened chasing forbidden power, was that he had run out of clean solutions 40 minutes ago, and was now improvising with the desperate elegance of a man juggling knives he had already dropped once. The cloak had wrapped itself twice around his forearm, bracing him as the last containment sigil guttered, and Strange had done the only thing left to do. He had reached past the Congo, past the leaking ley lines, past the collapsing architecture of that small local catastrophe, and pulled on the deep structure of reality itself, the old cold current beneath all currents, meaning to redirect the whole flood somewhere it could bleed off harmlessly into the space between worlds. He had done this kind of thing before. He knew, with the bone-deep certainty of a man who has burned his hands on the same stove 100 times and never quite stopped reaching for it, exactly how dangerous that current was, and exactly how careful you had to be holding it. What he did not know, could not have known, because no cosmology available to Kamar-Taj had ever mapped it. No dimension he had catalogued across 15 years of study had ever so much as brushed against it. Was that a few thousand miles, and one entire category of reality away, in a city called Shibuya, in a country he had visited twice and liked quite a lot. Something else was tearing a hole in the world at exactly the same instant, for entirely unrelated reasons, with a violence that made his own crisis look like a leaking faucet. 2 ruptures, 2 different kinds of impossible, and for one unrepeatable heartbeat, they found each other. Shibuya Station, that hour, was no longer a train station. It had stopped being one the moment the barrier went up. A dome of cursed technique stretched invisible and absolute across the district, sealing in 100,000 ordinary commuters, with something that had been waiting a very long time to eat them. The platforms ran with black smoke and worse. Overturned kiosks spilled their wares across tile slick with rain that had started falling sometime after the sky itself had been made to bleed cursed energy from a dozen simultaneous incidents. Jogo somewhere to the north laying waste to a city block in his hunt for Satoru Gojo. Mahito somewhere in the crowd wearing whatever face suited his current amusement. And beneath it all, coiled and patient and only just beginning to stretch, the thing wearing Megumi Fushiguro's body like an ill-fitting coat. It was into this, into the screaming, into the smoke, into cursed energy so dense it sat on the lungs like ash, that the world tore open above the Dogenzaka intersection and dropped a man in a red cloak into the middle of Shibuya's worst night in a century. Strange hit the wet pavement in a controlled roll that would have looked almost dignified if he hadn't come up swearing in 3 languages, the cloak snapping taut behind him like a sail catching wind that wasn't there, already scanning. Old instinct, older than fear, for the shape of the threat, before the shape of the danger had even finished registering as strange. And there was a great deal to register. The sky over the intersection wasn't simply dark, it was wrong, laced through with threads of crimson and black that pulsed in rhythm with something enormous somewhere close, something he could feel the way you feel a held breath in a room before someone screams. The air tasted of copper and ozone and something else beneath that, something his astral senses, trained across 100 hostile dimensions, tuned to recognize the particular flavor of malevolence the multiverse produced when it wanted to be noticed, flagged immediately as alive, hungry, and not remotely interested in negotiation. He had felt magic before that ran on blood and sacrifice, on cosmic bargains and stolen names. He had felt the grinding weight of the dark dimension and the oily patience of things that lived in the spaces between stars. This was none of those. And that was the first true alarm bell. Not that it was powerful, though it was, staggeringly, but that it was foreign, built on a structure he had no ready name for. Not sorcery drawn from outer gods or inner will, something that lived in people, that curdled out of fear and malice and grief, the way rust grows on iron left in rain, and that had apparently, in this city, on this night, been given free rein to become something close to a god. A woman ran past him screaming, dragging a child by the wrist, and Strange's hand was already moving before his mind had fully caught up to his instincts. A shield of the seraphim snapping into being between them and the collapsing kiosk awning that would otherwise have crushed them both. The barrier's amber lattice flaring once, briefly visible, before he let it drop. The woman didn't stop running, didn't look back. He hadn't expected her to. People in the middle of the end of their world rarely pause to admire the craftsmanship of what saved them. Focus, Stephen. He turned the eye of Agamotto's pendant once between two fingers. Old habit, not yet ready to open it, not yet, and began walking toward the source of that pulsing crimson wrongness in the sky, because whatever else this was, whatever alien grammar of power he had fallen into, one truth held across every dimension he had ever visited. The thing radiating that much malevolent gravity was the thing worth understanding first. He did not have to walk far. The curse found him first. Or rather, he found it. A thing built roughly like a man and roughly like a dog, and entirely unlike either. All wrong joints, and too many teeth, arranged in a face that seemed to have been assembled by someone working from second-hand descriptions of what a face was supposed to be. It came around the corner of a collapsed noodle stand, low and fast, cursed energy roiling off its hide like heat off summer asphalt, and it did not hesitate before it lunged. Strange had half a second to register the specifics, the way its claws trailed threads of that same black-red energy, the way its jaw unhinged wider than the architecture of a skull should reasonably allow, and then it was on him, and he did what 15 years at Kamar-Taj had drilled into muscle memory so deep it no longer required conscious thought. He bent the space between them. The curse's leap carried it through empty air, where Strange's chest had been a heartbeat before, momentum betraying it into an ungainly crash against the ruined stand. And Strange came around, already weaving a crimson bands of cyterac with both hands, intending to bind the thing before it could reorient. The bands closed around it, held for exactly as long as it took the creature to notice they were there. And then, this was the second alarm bell, quieter than the first but no less important. It simply tore through them, the mystic restraint parting like wet paper, under claws soaked in that ambient cursed pressure, as though the binding had been made of ordinary rope, and not the woven will of an elder god. Interesting, Strange thought, with the specific, dangerous calm he reserved for moments when things were going wrong in ways worth studying later, assuming there was a later. So this place runs on a different current entirely. Noted. He didn't have time to be more thorough about the diagnosis. The curse came again, and this time Strange didn't bother with a binding. He simply stepped sideways through a fold in space no wider than a doorway, appearing 6 feet to the creature's left as it barreled through where he'd stood. And this time when he struck, it was with the cloak's own strength, the crimson fabric lashing out like something with a spine and a grudge, wrapping the creature's throat and driving it bodily into a shattered storefront window, with a force that would have concussed a bull elephant. The curse didn't get back up cleanly. It thrashed, half dissolving at the edges into black smoke the way he'd already begun to suspect these things did when badly hurt, and Strange closed the distance and finished it with a controlled burst of the winds of Watum, precise as a scalpel, and watched it come apart entirely into drifting ash that the wind took and scattered across the wet street. He stood there a moment in the ringing quiet after, rain running down the back of his neck, and allowed himself exactly one full breath to actually think. Cursed energy, he decided, filing the term away, though he had no idea yet if it was the right one. It was simply the shape the concept took in his mind. A black-red current running through every hostile thing he'd encountered so far, dense as a held threat. It didn't behave like the astral plane. It didn't behave like magic drawn from any pantheon or dimension he'd catalogued. It behaved, if anything, like will made physical, concentrated intent, curdled and given teeth. His own power, the sorcery of Kamar-Taj, ran on an entirely separate structure, drawn from dimensional current, from oath and study, and the old bargain struck by sorcerers 3,000 years dead. That was, he was beginning to suspect, exactly why the binding spell had failed to hold. He'd tried to constrain something running on an unfamiliar current using a spell keyed to his own. A category error, not a failure of strength. His shields, at least, seemed to work regardless. Raw force and durability translated well enough across whatever cosmic boundary separated his magic from this world's. That was useful. That was something to build on. And the thing making that sky bleed, he thought, looking up again at the pulsing crimson wound in the clouds, is not going to care how elegant my theory is. He became aware, distantly and then not so distantly, of voices, real voices, human ones, arguing somewhere close through the smoke, sharp with the particular urgency of people who were used to this kind of catastrophe and hated it anyway. He followed the sound. He found them at the mouth of a side street where the barrier's boundary bent close to the surface world. 3 teenagers, unmistakably teenagers despite the blood and the exhaustion carved into their faces, standing over the ruin of something that had recently been another of the dog-faced things, arguing in rapid Japanese that Strange's astral-trained ear parsed just quickly enough to catch the shape of it. "We need to fall back. We need to find the others." Someone said Gojo-sensei went dark near the station. That can't be right. Gojo doesn't go dark. They saw him at the same moment he saw them, and every one of them went instantly, professionally still. The particular stillness of people trained to assess a threat in under a second. The girl with the hammer already shifting her weight forward. The boy with the pink hair stepping half in front of the smaller dark-haired one. All 3 of them staring at the man in the blue tunic and the impossible red cloak standing in the wreckage of their city, like he'd stepped out of an entirely different kind of nightmare. "That's not a curse," the pink-haired boy said. Not quite a question. Cursed energy already gathering visible and violent around his clenched fist. "Is that not a curse?" "I promise you," Strange said, raising both hands slowly, palms open, in the universal grammar of, "I am not currently trying to kill you," a gesture that had worked with startling consistency across several dozen hostile dimensions. "I am at least as confused about all of this as you are. Possibly more." The girl with the orange-brown hair didn't lower her hammer. "English," she said, flat, to the others, like that was its own kind of evidence. "Dr. Stephen Strange," he offered, because names, in his experience, tended to do more diplomatic work than explanations. "I have no idea what city this is, no idea what that thing in the sky is, and no idea what the current running through everything trying to kill me tonight actually is. Cursed energy, I'm told. Though I'm inventing that name myself as I go. I would very much appreciate it if the 3 of you didn't add yourselves to the list of things trying to kill me, because from where I'm standing, you look like you're already having a bad enough night." A long pause. Rain fell into it. "He talks like Gojo-sensei when he's stalling," the dark-haired boy muttered. "I am absolutely not stalling," Strange said, with the specific, weary honesty of a man who genuinely was not, this once. Though I understand the suspicion. It was the girl who finally lowered the hammer, if only an inch, her sharp eyes never leaving his face. "Nobara Kugisaki," she said. "Jujutsu High, 1st year. That's Yuji, that's Megumi." A jerk of her chin toward each in turn. If you're not a curse, and you're not a sorcerer, what are you? Strange considered the question with the particular care of a man who had, across 15 years, been asked some version of it, in nearly every language and dimension available to him, and had learned that the honest answer usually served better than the impressive one. Someone very far from home, he said, who just watched two entirely unrelated disasters collide badly enough to throw him into the middle of a third. He glanced again at the wound in the sky, the pulse of it, the way it seemed to be breathing, and someone who would like very much to understand what that is, before it finishes whatever it's building toward. Megumi followed his gaze upward, and something crossed his face, recognition, and beneath the recognition, dread, quiet and old, and entirely too calm for a boy his age to be carrying. That's not building toward anything, he said. That's already happened. That's Sukuna waking all the way up. The name meant nothing to Strange. He would learn, before the night was finished, exactly how much weight it was supposed to carry. But even without the history, even without a single fact about the King of Curses, he felt it settle into him anyway, the way you feel the temperature drop before a storm you can't yet see. A certainty, cold and immediate, that whatever was waking beneath that bleeding sky, he had arrived just in time to be standing in its way. The cloak tightened faintly around his shoulders, an old and familiar gesture that had never once, across every dimension it had followed him into, meant anything good. Then, Strange said, already turning toward the source of that pulse, already feeling the first threads of a plan assemble themselves out of raw improvisation and the stubborn, unkillable habit of a man who had made a career out of standing between the world and things that wanted to end it. I suppose we'd better go meet him. They did not go meet him immediately, because Nobara Kugisaki, for all her willingness to lower a hammer, was not willing to march an unknown quantity in a red cape toward the single most dangerous entity currently active in the barrier, without first establishing some baseline of what he could actually do. And Strange, watching her make that calculation in real time, found himself respecting her for it even as it cost them precious minutes. "Show me something," she said. "Not a party trick. Something that tells me whether you're worth bringing anywhere near Sukuna, or whether you're going to get us all killed being useless." It was, Strange reflected, an entirely reasonable request from someone who had clearly already watched too many people die that night, making optimistic bets on unproven allies. He didn't reach for anything showy. He reached, instead, for the eye of Agamotto, and let it fall open against his chest, not the full weight of the Time Stone's power. Nothing so reckless as that in a city already straining under enough temporal-adjacent horror for one evening, but a narrow thread of it, enough to unspool the last 30 seconds of the alley behind them and watch, with the three sorcerers' students, as a curse that had been stalking them unseen through the smoke, replayed its approach in ghostly amber light, freezing at the exact moment it would have struck Megumi from behind. Megumi went very still. "That's a temporal technique," he said, quiet, and something in his voice had shifted. Not trust, not yet, but the specific attention of someone recalibrating a threat assessment upward. A high-grade one. You can see the past. "I can do rather more than see it," Strange said, closing the eye, "though I'd prefer not to demonstrate the rest unless I have to. Time is not a toy, even where I come from, and I have watched entire dimensions come apart from someone treating it like one." He looked at each of them in turn. "That thing was 3 feet behind you a moment ago. It isn't anymore." A gesture, small, toward the drifting ash already dissolving in the rain. He'd unmade it in the same motion he'd unspooled the vision, a courtesy he hadn't bothered announcing. Yuji let out a breath that was half a laugh, entirely without humor. "Okay, yeah, that's okay. I vote we bring the wizard." "He's not a wizard," Nobara said, though the hammer had dropped fully to her side now. "Probably. I don't actually know what he is." "Sorcerer," Strange offered. "Same union, Different local, I suspect. Megumi didn't smile. Strange got the sense the boy rarely did, even on nights considerably better than this one. But the tension in his shoulders eased by some fractional telling degree. Nanami's team fell back toward the east exit 20 minutes ago, he said, already moving, cursed energy gathering faint and controlled around his hands as he walked. If Sukuna's fully surfaced, he'll want space and bodies. That means he's heading for the open ground around the station plaza. If we're doing this, we go together, and you listen when one of us says fall back, not because we don't trust what you can do, because we don't know what you can't. That, Strange said, falling into step beside him, is the single most sensible thing anyone in this city has said to me tonight. They moved through Shibuya's ruined skin, in a loose diamond formation. Strange recognized instantly, as trained, professional, the product of people who had drilled this exact kind of urban horror show more times than any teenager should have had to. Yuji taking point with the loose, coiled readiness of a boxer, Nobara covering the flanks with quick, precise glances and a hammer she kept spinning idly between strikes like she was bleeding off nervous energy through her hands, Megumi hanging back at an angle that let him watch 3 directions at once, murmuring something under his breath that made the shadows around his feet ripple and thicken into shapes Strange's astral senses flagged as summoned, contained, disciplined, a dog, then 2, padding low and silent at his heels like extensions of his own will. Shikigami, Megumi said, catching Strange's glance. Summons, curse technique. And the other students, Strange said, they each have their own discipline? School? I confess I'm building this vocabulary as we go. Innate technique, Yuji said, not looking back, scanning a collapsed overpass for movement. Everyone's is different. Nobara's is nails and a hammer. Don't ask. It's better if she shows you. Megumi's shadows. Mine's. A pause. Something complicated crossing his face even in profile. Mine's complicated. We'll get there. Strange filed the evasion away without commenting on it. Every dimension he'd ever walked through had its share of people carrying something complicated behind their eyes, and pressing on it in the middle of an active catastrophe rarely produced anything but resentment. The city around them told its own story in fragments. A subway entrance collapsed inward, as though something enormous had climbed out of it rather than descended in. A row of vending machines melted sideways in a pattern of heat warp that made Strange's astral senses prickle with a signature he was beginning to associate with the volcanic entity Megumi had called Jogo, somewhere still raging to the north. Storefronts stripped bare not by looting but by something closer to a tide going out. Glass and steel bent inward at angles that suggested pressure rather than impact. Pressure of a kind Strange recognized from exactly one place in his own experience. The crush of a collapsing pocket dimension. The world trying to fold in on a wound that shouldn't exist. That's what this whole district is, he realized, with the cold clarity of a diagnosis finally clicking into place. Not a battlefield, a wound. Someone has turned an entire city block into a controlled dimensional rupture, and everyone still breathing inside it is trapped in the bleeding. He didn't share the thought yet. It wasn't useful information until he understood the shape of the hand holding the knife. They found that hand's shape sooner than any of them wanted to. The station plaza opened up ahead of them through a gap in the smoke, and Strange stopped walking. He had stood in the presence of Dormammu's hunger. He had felt the crushing, patient malice of nightmare reaching for a sleeping mind. He had, once, on a very bad afternoon in a dimension he did not care to revisit, shaken hands with something that called itself a god, and had not entirely been lying. He had built, across 15 years, a fairly comprehensive internal scale for how much dread a given entity ought to be radiating, and the thing standing in the center of the ruined plaza broke that scale so completely that for one full second, Strange simply stood very still and recalibrated. It wore, unmistakably, the shape of a teenage boy, dark hair plastered to his forehead with rain, and worse, the same black and navy uniform Strange's three companions wore, torn now, and marked with cursed energy crawling across the exposed skin, in patterns like something tattooed by a very patient, very ancient hand. But the eyes were wrong in a way that had nothing to do with color or shape. A second set had opened above the first, and the mouth, when it curved into something that might have been amusement, revealed a second and third set of teeth in gashes that hadn't been there a moment before, cutting open across each cheek, like the face itself was a door being pried wider. Around him, the air didn't merely bend, it knelt. Cursed energy poured off the figure in a pressure Strange could feel against his own skin, like standing too close to an open furnace, dense and patient and vast in a way that made the dog-faced curse he'd dispatched an hour ago feel, in retrospect, like a child's shadow puppet held up against a solar eclipse. Bodies lay scattered across the plaza. Not many, Strange registered with grim relief, most of the civilian population having apparently been evacuated or fled before this stage of the catastrophe. But enough, sorcerers by the look of their torn dark uniforms, enough to tell him plainly that whoever this was had already been tested tonight and had not been found wanting. Sukuna, Megumi said, and his voice had gone flat and careful in the specific way of someone speaking a name he genuinely feared might be summoned by the saying of it. The figure's head turned, slow, unhurried, the kind of unhurried that belonged only to things that had never once, in a very long memory, needed to hurry for anyone. Its gaze passed over the three students with an indifference so total it was almost an insult, the casual dismissal of a man glancing over furniture, and then it reached Strange, and stopped. For one long moment, nothing in the plaza moved. Rain fell through cursed energy thick enough to taste, and Ryomen Sukuna, king of curses, a being Strange would later learn had been feared across 1,000 years of this world's history, under 100 different names, looked at a man in a red cloak who did not belong to this world at all, and, for the first time that Megumi Fushiguro would ever witness, in all the horror of that endless night, something crossed the king of curses' ruined, ancient face that was unmistakably, genuinely, curiosity. "Well," Sukuna said, in a voice that carried easily across the whole ruined plaza, without seeming to raise itself at all, dry amusement threaded through old contempt. "Now that's a scent I don't recognize." Strange had learned, across 15 years of confronting things that considered themselves apex predators of reality, that the first exchange of words in a standoff like this one mattered enormously. Not for what it revealed to the enemy, but for what it revealed to the people standing beside you who needed, urgently, to believe you weren't about to get them all killed by saying the wrong thing to something that clearly enjoyed killing. So he did not reach for power first. He reached for information. "You have the advantage of me," he said, and let the words carry across the plaza with the same unhurried weight Sukuna's own voice had used, refusing to be the smaller presence in the exchange even though every instinct honed across a decade and a half of dimensional horror was screaming at him that he was standing in front of something that could very possibly kill him in the time it took to finish the sentence. "You seem to know a scent when you smell one. I don't even know what to call you yet." Sukuna's ruined, ancient face tilted, and the second mouth carved into his cheek stretched with something that might, in a kinder creature, have been called delight. "Sukuna," he said, "though I doubt the name will mean much to you, stranger, seeing as you don't smell like anything that's ever walked this world." A slow breath, drawn in through both mouths at once, and Strange felt the pressure in the plaza's air thicken, curious now rather than merely threatening, a predator sniffing at prey that had wandered in from somewhere entirely outside its hunting grounds. No cursed energy, no soul stink of a curse user, no clean stink of a sorcerer. You're something else entirely, and I've lived a very long time collecting something else entirely like other men collect trophies. Behind Strange, he heard Nobara's breath catch, heard Yuji's stance shift a fraction wider, bracing. Megumi said nothing at all, which Strange was already coming to understand was the boy's version of shouting. "Stephen Strange," he said. "Sorcerer Supreme, for whatever that title's worth on this side of whatever tore me here. And I'll be honest with you, since you seem disinclined toward pleasantries, I have no interest in becoming anyone's trophy tonight." "Interest," Sukuna said, and laughed. A short, genuinely delighted sound that landed in the ruined plaza like a blade being drawn, "is not a quality I generally require from my collection." The attack came without any further ceremony, and it came fast enough that Strange understood, in the single suspended heartbeat before it landed, exactly why 3 trained sorcerer students had gone rigid with dread at the mere sight of this thing standing upright. Sukuna didn't gather power visibly, didn't telegraph with the kind of ritual build-up Strange had learned to read across 100 hostile dimensions. He simply moved, cursed energy condensing into a blade of dense, crackling red-black force that carved through the space between them almost faster than sight, aimed with contemptuous precision at a line that would have opened Strange from collarbone to hip. It should have connected. By every metric Strange's astral senses had clocked in the half-second available to process the strike. The speed alone should have made it unavoidable to anyone without precognition. He didn't dodge it. He folded space instead. A trick old enough that he barely had to think the geometry of it anymore. A fold no larger than a door, opening 6 feet to Sukuna's left and closing behind him in the same motion, so that from Sukuna's perspective, the stranger in the red cloak simply wasn't there anymore. The cursed blade, cleaving empty air and gouging a smoking trench 4 feet deep into the plaza's ruined pavement where he'd stood. The 3 students actually flinched at the sound of it. A crack like the sky splitting, pavement and rebar thrown skyward in a spray that rained back down as gravel, and Strange, reappearing at Sukuna's flank with the cloak already snapping wide behind him, felt something settle in his chest that was not quite relief, and not quite excitement but shared blood with both. Fast, precise, contemptuous of anything he hasn't already catalogued as dangerous. Good. Contempt makes enemies careless, right up until it doesn't. "That's new," Sukuna said, turning unhurried to face him again, and the curiosity in his voice had sharpened now into something with an edge on it, something that had just recalculated its opponent's category, and did not entirely enjoy the recalculation. "You didn't dodge it. You weren't there. I find," Strange said, weaving the first threads of a shield of the seraphim into being between his palms, letting the amber lattice of it catch the crimson light of the wounded sky, "that not being where the sharp things are is generally an excellent survival strategy. I'd recommend it, except I get the impression you've rarely needed it." "I haven't," Sukuna agreed, and this time when he moved it was with less contempt and considerably more intent, a second blade of condensed cursed energy forming, even as the first attack's echo was still settling dust across the plaza, and this time it came in a spread, 3 strikes fanned wide instead of 1, clearly meant to punish exactly the kind of spatial evasion Strange had just demonstrated. Strange had half a second to admire the tactical adjustment before he was forced to actually survive it. He didn't fold space again. Sukuna had adapted too fast, boxed the option out before it could be used twice. So instead he threw the shield of the seraphim full and wide, both hands driving the amber lattice into a dome around himself, just as the 3 blades converged, and felt, for the first time that night, exactly how much force this world's strongest curse was capable of putting behind a single dismissive gesture. The shield held, barely. It held the way a seawall holds against a wave that has already begun, in the moment of impact, to reconsider whether the wall was built tall enough. A shudder ran up both of Strange's arms hard enough to numb them to the elbow, hairline cracks spreading gold-white across the amber lattice in branching patterns, and the sound of the impact rolled out across the plaza like thunder given a grudge. But it held, and through the fracturing amber, Strange watched Sukuna's face register. Not alarm, nothing so generous as alarm, but the specific, cold recalibration of a being who had just learned his newest curiosity might cost him more effort than he'd budgeted for. Sukuna said, and for the first time, took a genuine step back to reassess, rather than press an advantage. You're not a sorcerer. You're not a curse. You held that without a domain, without a barrier technique. On pure, the word seemed to genuinely displease him, an admission dragged out sideways. Craft. I've had rather a lot of practice, Strange said, letting the cracked shield dissolve, breathing hard now, in a way he was careful not to let show in his voice, because the truth beneath the composure was that the block had cost him considerably more than he wanted this creature to know. You're not the first thing I've met that thought itself the strongest force in its own house. And how did those meetings end? Sukuna asked, and there was real interest in it now, stripped of the earlier contempt entirely. Poorly, Strange said, for the house. Something in Sukuna's ruined, ancient face shifted then. Not fear. Strange was fairly certain fear was not an emotion this particular creature retained the architecture for, but something adjacent to it, a predator's recognition that it had, for the first time in what was very possibly a very long memory, encountered prey worth actually hunting properly. I like you, Sukuna decided, with the terrible, casual finality of a man deciding what to have for dinner. I'm going to enjoy finding out what's under that cloak. And behind Strange, close enough now that he could hear the tight, controlled edge in the boy's voice, Yuji Itadori said, low and urgent, Dr. Strange, whatever you're about to do it fast, because that's the nice version of him talking, and I have personally seen what happens after he stops being nice. Strange had exactly enough time to file Yuji's warning away as useful data before the plaza came apart around him. Sukuna didn't gather cursed energy so much as release it, the way a held breath releases. The crimson-black pressure that had been coiled tight around his frame since Strange first laid eyes on him, now expanding outward in a shockwave that cracked what remained of the plaza's paving stones and sent Nobara, Yuji, and Megumi scattering for cover behind the shattered husk of a ticket kiosk without needing to be told twice. The air itself seemed to thicken, curdle, take on weight, and Strange, standing at the center of it, felt for the first time that night something he recognized with grim, professional clarity as outmatched raw output, the specific sensation of standing in a current far stronger than the vessel you'd brought to hold it back. He didn't panic. Panic was a luxury for people who hadn't spent 15 years learning that the correct response to overwhelming force was rarely to match it head-on. Instead, he opened 3 portals at once, a discipline he'd practiced across 100 hostile encounters until it had become as natural as breathing, a triangle of shimmering orange circles blinking into existence around Sukuna's flanks and rear, meant not to attack, but to fragment his attention, to force a being accustomed to total dominance over every fight he'd ever been in, to suddenly account for the possibility of an unseen angle. Sukuna's second set of eyes, the ones above his brow, the ones that opened only when his true nature surfaced fully, swept across all 3 portals in the same instant, and Strange watched with something close to professional admiration as the King of Curses simply refused to be baited into overcommitting to any single one of them. Instead, he drove a 4th blade of condensed cursed energy straight down through the center of the triangle, into the empty space where a lesser opponent might have expected him to stand and wasn't, and the strike tore a crater 8 feet across into the plaza's foundation, throwing up a wall of pulverized concrete and rebar that Strange had to fold space through rather than around. appearing on the crater's far lip with his coat singed and his ears ringing from the concussion. "You keep doing that," Sukuna observed, unhurried, already turning to track him. "The not being where I expect thing. It's clever. It's also," and here the second mouth on his cheek stretched wide with genuine delight, "starting to bore me, which is worse for you than if it had simply failed." "Duly noted," Strange said, and reached, for the first time that night, past the careful defensive craft he'd been leaning on, and into something with real teeth. He drew the Vishanti's power into both hands, Agamotto's clarity, Ashtur's structure, Hoggoth's binding will, the old triune current that formed the backbone of every serious working a sorcerer of his rank could call on, and shaped it into a construct he hadn't used since a particularly bad afternoon defending New York from an incursion that had nearly cost him the whole sanctum. The vapors of Valtor, a corrosive golden mist that didn't merely burn but unmade, dissolving the specific molecular cohesion of whatever it touched. He didn't expect it to kill Sukuna. He'd already recalibrated his expectations twice in the last 90 seconds, and had stopped assuming anything about this creature's durability. What he expected, what he needed, was information, whether cursed flesh, cursed regeneration, whatever engine powered that terrible casual invincibility, responded to a corrosive working built for dissolving matter at a structural level the way ordinary flesh did, or whether, like the binding spell that had failed against the dog-faced curse an hour earlier, it would simply shrug off a working keyed to the wrong current entirely. The golden mist rolled across the crater and found Sukuna standing at its center, and for one suspended moment nothing happened at all. And Strange thought, with a sinking certainty, "Wrong current, it's not going to." And then Sukuna's exposed forearm, where the mist had settled thickest, began to smoke. Not much. Not the catastrophic dissolution the working would have visited on an ordinary target, not even close. The injury that bloomed there was shallow, a surface burn no worse than a bad scald, already knitting closed even as Strange watched with the particular fascination of a man conducting a very dangerous experiment on the fly. But it was an injury. The mist had found purchase where the binding spell had found none. Sukuna looked down at his own smoking forearm, with an expression Strange hadn't yet seen cross that ruined ancient face. Not pain, nowhere close to pain, but genuine, startled interest, the look of a man who has been told for 1,000 years that a particular door does not open, and has just watched it crack an inch on its hinges. "Huh," Sukuna said, and the single syllable carried more weight than the whole rest of the fight combined. "That's not nothing." "No," Strange agreed, breathing hard, already feeling the cost of that casting, settling into his shoulders like lead. "It isn't. Though I notice it isn't much of anything either, which tells me your regeneration is considerably faster than most things I've corroded down to the studs." "Everything about me is considerably faster than most things," Sukuna said, and flexed the already healing forearm with something that might, on a more human face, have been called satisfaction. "So, not nothing. Interesting. Painful even, which is a word almost nobody gets to use about me twice in the same century." He rolled his shoulders, and the crimson-black pressure around him thickened again, gathering toward something Strange's every instinct screamed was going to be considerably worse than anything that had come before it. "I think," Sukuna said, almost conversationally, "we should stop being polite about this." The ground beneath Strange's feet began, very softly, to hum, a resonance he recognized on some deep, old animal level as the sound reality made in the instant before something tried to fold an entire section of it into a shape it was never meant to hold. And behind him, from the shelter of the ruined kiosk, he heard Megumi's voice crack out sharp and urgent. "Dr. Strange, domain. He's opening a domain expansion. Get out of the..." The rest of the warning was lost, drowned under a pressure that dropped over the entire plaza, like the lid of a coffin closing, the crimson-black sky above them tearing wide open into something that was no longer merely a wound, but a space. An entire self-contained reality unfolding outward from Sukuna's raised hand, a vast malevolent dome of shredded red malice, an infinity of curved blades suspended and turning in a killing geometry that made Strange's own mastery of the astral dimension feel, for one genuinely humbling instant, like a child's chalk drawing held up against the real thing. Malevolent Shrine, he would learn to call it. Later, when there was time for names. In the instant it closed over him, he knew only that he had just been swallowed whole by something that did not intend to let him leave, and that every scalpel-fast blade suspended in that crimson infinity was already turning, unhurried and absolute, toward him. He had exactly the length of one indrawn breath to decide whether the eye of Agamotto's true power, the thing he had sworn, 3 separate times across 3 separate catastrophes, never to reach for again except as the very last option available to him, was worth the price of using it now, in a world he didn't understand, against a domain whose rules he had not had time to learn. The blades began to fall. There was no time for the last option. There was barely time for the second to last. Strange did not open the eye of Agamotto, some old, stubborn, hard-won wisdom in him, forged across 3 separate catastrophes where he'd paid too high a price for that kind of power, screamed that reaching for time itself inside a domain whose rules he did not understand was the fastest possible way to die, somewhere no one would ever find the pieces. Instead, he did the only other thing available to a man with half a heartbeat and an infinity of blades converging on him from every angle at once. He stopped trying to survive the domain and tried instead to leave it. He tore open a portal not sideways, not to some safer patch of ground within the Crimson Shrine's borders, but up, straight through the fabric of the domain itself, a working he had never attempted against anything like this and would not, if he survived the next several seconds, ever wish to attempt again, forcing raw dimensional current through a boundary that fought him at every layer like trying to cut a wound through something that was actively trying to heal shut around the blade. It should not have worked. Domain expansions, he would later understand, guaranteed a hit against anything caught inside their border precisely because nothing was meant to leave once the border closed. That was the entire terrible elegance of the technique, an inevitability made manifest. But Strange's magic did not run on cursed energy's current, had never run on it, and the domain's guarantee, built to close every escape a cursed energy-based technique could exploit, simply did not have an answer for someone trying to leave through a door it hadn't known needed locking. The portal held for exactly as long as it needed to. Strange threw himself through it a half-second before the nearest blade would have opened his spine, and came out the other side into open, rain-soaked air 20 feet above the plaza's ruined pavement, already falling, already disoriented, the cloak snapping wide beneath him, and slowing the drop into something survivable rather than something fatal. He hit the ground rolling, came up with both hands already weaving a defensive ward on pure reflex, and looked back to find the crimson dome of Malevolent Shrine still standing, still turning, blades still falling impatient, endless rotation against a target that was no longer there. For one full second, nothing happened. Then the dome convulsed. Strange had no better word for it. A visible ripple of something like startled fury passing through the whole vast malevolent architecture of it, and collapsed inward, folding back down into Sukuna's raised hand, as fast as it had opened, the crimson sky above the plaza clearing, to reveal a king of curses staring at the space, where his guaranteed kill had simply, impossibly, not been. "You left," Sukuna said, and for the first time since the fight had begun, there was something in his voice that was not amusement, not curiosity, not even the sharpened interest of a moment ago, but something colder and considerably more dangerous, genuine, undiluted offense. Nothing leaves a domain. That's the entire point of a domain. I've been told that rule an unusual number of times tonight, Strange said, forcing his voice level though his whole body was screaming from the cost of what he'd just done, sweat and rain running together down the back of his neck. And yet here I remain, disappointing everyone. Sukuna's jaw tightened, both jaws, all three mouths pulling into something that had stopped being delight and started being the specific fury of a predator whose oldest and most reliable weapon had just failed for the first time in longer than he cared to remember. The crimson-black pressure around him didn't merely thicken now. It roared upward, cursed energy pouring off his frame in visible waves that cracked the remaining unbroken pavement of the plaza and sent both students still sheltering behind the ruined kiosk, pressing flatter against the stone, hands over their ears against a pressure that had become almost a physical sound. "Fine," Sukuna said, and the word came out flat, final, stripped of every ounce of the earlier amusement. "No more testing. No more curiosity. I'm going to open you up properly and see what's actually inside you, stranger. And I promise you it will hurt considerably more than what came before." Strange, watching the gathering violence of what was coming with the specific, focused calm of a man who had run out of clever tricks and had only honest strength left to offer, allowed himself one breath, one full, deliberate breath, the kind Wong had drilled into him 100 times in the Sanctum's training yard. "Center yourself before the real fight, Stephen. The panic is the first thing that gets you killed." And reached, finally, past craft and cleverness, and into the deep, costly current of raw power he'd been rationing since the fight began. The Vishanti's true strength answered him the way it always did, reluctantly, expensively, and completely. "Then let's stop testing," Strange agreed, and around him the air itself began to burn gold. What followed, Yuji Itadori would later try to describe to Nanami Kento in the debrief that came after the worst night of his life, and would fail, every time, to find words equal to it. The stranger in the red cloak did not fight Sukuna so much as answer him. Every strike met not with evasion now but with raw force thrown directly into the King of Curse's own overwhelming output, gold against crimson black. The two currents grinding against each other in the ruined plaza with a violence that stripped the last standing walls from 3 surrounding buildings and threw a shockwave outward that shattered windows for 2 blocks in every direction. Strange wove crimson bands reinforced with layered dimensional anchors that held, this time for nearly 4 full seconds before Sukuna tore free of them with a roar that cracked the sky. Sukuna answered with a barrage of condensed cursed energy blades fired in a spread wide enough to saturate the entire plaza, and Strange folded space 6 separate times in as many seconds, appearing and vanishing in flashes of orange light like a man playing a game of dimensional chess against an opponent trying to murder him on every single move. Neither of them was winning. Strange understood that with growing, grim clarity somewhere around the 90th second of the exchange, Sukuna's regeneration was simply too fast, closing wounds from the vapors of Valtor and every other corrosive working Strange dared throw at him almost as quickly as they opened, while Strange's own reserves, drawn from a body that had crossed an unknown dimensional boundary less than 2 hours ago and had been fighting at full output nearly every minute since, were beginning, unmistakably, to run dry. "I cannot win this by attrition," he thought, dodging a blade that opened a shallow line across his forearm despite the fold, blood running warm and immediate down to his wrist. "He has centuries of reserves. I have whatever I brought through the tear, and nothing more." He was still turning that grim arithmetic over, still searching through 15 years of hard-won craft for some angle he hadn't yet tried, when the plaza's ruined skyline lit up gold-white from a completely different direction, and a voice Strange hadn't heard before, light, almost bored, carrying easily across the whole battlefield the way Sukuna's own voice had, called out into the chaos with the specific, devastating calm of someone who had just walked into the single most dangerous fight in the city and found it merely interesting. "Sukuna," the voice said, "you're a long way from where I left you." And every hair on the back of Strange's neck rose at once, some deep animal instinct recognizing, before his conscious mind had finished processing it, that an entirely new and entirely different order of power had just entered the plaza, one that, judging by the sudden, genuine wariness that flickered across even Sukuna's ancient, contemptuous face, might be the first thing all night that the King of Curses had ever actually learned to respect. Strange turned, chest heaving, gold current still humming faint along his fingertips, and found the source of the voice standing at the plaza's shattered northern edge, as though he'd simply strolled out of some entirely calmer evening. Tall, white-haired, a black blindfold wrapped over his eyes despite the fact that he was clearly, unmistakably, taking in every detail of the battlefield in front of him. His uniform jacket hung open over a dark shirt, hands loose at his sides, and he carried himself with a kind of weightless, unbothered ease that seemed, on its face, almost obscene given the ruins surrounding all three of them. But Strange had spent 15 years learning to read the difference between a man who was unbothered because he was foolish and a man who was unbothered because he had simply never had a reason to be otherwise. And everything about the pressure radiating off this new arrival, cold, vast, controlled with an absolute precision that made even Sukuna's overwhelming output feel comparatively undisciplined, told him unmistakably which category he was looking at. "Gojo," Megumi breathed from behind the ruined kiosk, and the relief in the single word was so raw it was almost painful to hear. Sukuna's ruined ancient face had gone carefully, deliberately blank, not fear. Strange still didn't believe this creature retained the architecture for fear, but something closer to a chess player recognizing that the board had just acquired a piece he could not simply overpower. "Satoru Gojo," he said, and the earlier casual contempt had thinned into something more measured. "I did wonder how long it would take you to notice I was busy elsewhere. You cut a rather large hole in my afternoon," Gojo said, still not moving from where he stood, still radiating that eerie, weightless calm. "I don't love that, but," and here his blindfolded gaze turned, unerringly, toward Strange, tracking him with an accuracy that made the absence of visible eyes somehow more unsettling rather than less. "I have to admit, I'm a lot more interested in whoever this is. Six Eyes says you're not from around here." "Not from any here I've got on file, actually, and I've got a pretty thorough file." "Stephen Strange," Strange said, and found, despite everything, a flicker of something almost like relief at finally facing someone who seemed inclined to lead with curiosity rather than a killing stroke. "Sorcerer Supreme, though I gather that title's not carrying much local currency tonight." "Huh, Sorcerer Supreme." Gojo tilted his head, and something in the set of his mouth suggested he was smiling behind the blindfold. "Bold branding. I like it." Then, without any visible transition, without any of the ceremony Strange had come to expect, proceeded a serious opening move. The temperature in the plaza dropped 10 degrees in the space of a single breath, and an enormous, silent pressure of pure, limitless technique gathered around Gojo's outstretched hand. No visible buildup beyond that cold and that pressure. Nothing Strange's astral senses could parse into a familiar shape, and that absence of a legible shape frightened him considerably more than Sukuna's overt violence ever had. "But you're standing in my incident," Gojo continued. "Conversational, terrifyingly casual, next to the single most dangerous thing currently active on this planet. And I've had a long night, so I'm going to need you to actually answer me before we get to the part where I find out what you're made of. Are you with him?" A nod toward Sukuna. "Or with us?" Strange became aware, in that suspended moment, that he had just been asked, by the second overwhelming, world-defining power he'd encountered in the space of an hour, to choose a side in a war he understood almost nothing about, in a world he'd fallen into by pure catastrophic accident, and that whatever he said next was very likely to determine how many more of these devastating strangers he'd be fighting for the rest of the night. He thought of the woman running with the child through the smoke, not stopping to look back. He thought of 3 teenagers standing over a dead curse, arguing about how to save people they'd never meet. He thought of Sukuna's casual, ancient contempt for every living thing in this city that wasn't strong enough to interest him. "I'm not with him," Strange said, and meant it with the particular clarity of a man who had, in fact, spent the last hour actively trying to keep the King of Curses from killing him and everyone standing near him. "I don't know your factions, your politics, or half of what that thing on your face is capable of doing to me. But I know what I just watched him do to this city, and in every dimension I've ever visited, that's usually enough information to pick a side." Something in Gojo's posture eased, fractionally. Not trust, not yet. Strange understood that much clearly, but the specific loosening of a man who had gotten the answer he was hoping for. "Good enough for now," Gojo said. "Ask me again in an hour if you're still breathing and I'll want a longer answer." Sukuna, watching this entire exchange with the flat, patient attention of something recalculating odds it did not enjoy recalculating, exhaled through both mouths at once, a sound that carried, unmistakably, real irritation. "How touching," he said. "A new toy, and you've already recruited him. Fine. I was growing tired of being interesting to only one of you." The crimson-black pressure around him thickened again, gathering, and Strange felt the plaza's air itself begin to strain under the promise of what was coming. "Let's see if 2 of you together are worth the trouble of killing at the same time." Gojo's blindfolded gaze didn't waver. "Funny," he said, lightly, and the cold pressure around his raised hand sharpened into something with an edge on it that made even the falling rain seem to hesitate in the air, refracting light in ways rain had no business refracting. "I was about to say the exact same thing, and Shibuya's ruined plaza, already scarred by one impossible battle, braced itself for a second." What happened next unfolded fast enough that Strange, watching from 10 feet away with every astral sense he possessed, straining to keep pace, would spend the rest of the night quietly grateful he wasn't the one standing at the center of it. Gojo didn't so much attack as rearrange the plaza around Sukuna. The King of Curses lunged. A blur of condensed cursed energy blades aimed to open him from 3 directions at once, and every single one of them simply stopped a foot short of contact, hanging suspended in the air as though they'd struck an invisible wall, before Gojo flicked 2 fingers and sent them hurtling back the way they'd come, with a force multiplier that turned Sukuna's own attack into a weapon against him. Sukuna twisted aside from his own reflected blades with a speed that would have been dizzying to watch if Strange hadn't spent the last hour recalibrating his entire scale for what fast was supposed to mean in this world, and came back around already weaving another attack, and Gojo simply wasn't where the attack landed. Having crossed 15 feet of ruined plaza in a blink, Strange's astral senses registered only as a discontinuity, a place where reality had briefly declined to render the intervening motion at all. "Infinity," Megumi murmured, low, from behind the kiosk, and Strange filed the word away, a technique that seemed to make the very concept of closing the distance mathematically impossible, an idea so fundamentally hostile to ordinary physics that Strange's own considerable understanding of dimensional mechanics ached faintly just trying to model it. Sukuna, for his part, had clearly encountered this wall before, and had equally clearly spent real effort learning to hate it properly. His attacks shifted, no longer trying to close distance directly, but flooding the air around Gojo with saturating bursts of cursed energy, meant to overwhelm the infinite barrier through sheer accumulated volume, rather than precision, a brute force answer to an elegant problem. It was, Strange had to admit, watching the exchange with the specific professional fascination of a man who loved a well-built spell almost as much as he loved surviving one, a genuinely intelligent adjustment. And it was working, marginally. Gojo's infinity held, but the sheer accumulated pressure of the barrage was visibly costing him something, a tightness entering his jaw that hadn't been there a minute ago. Strange became aware, watching this, that he had a choice to make: stand back and let two apex predators determine this fight between themselves, while he caught his breath and rebuilt his depleted reserves, or find some way to make himself useful in a battle whose rules he still only half understood. He chose the second option, because standing back while a city burned had never once, in 15 years, been an option his conscience actually let him take. Left flank, he called out to Gojo, already weaving a construct with what reserves he had left. Not an attack. He had nowhere near the strength left for another direct clash with either combatant, but a shield of the Seraphim thrown wide and thin, meant to intercept a portion of the saturating cursed energy barrage before it could add its full weight to what was already straining Gojo's barrier. Gojo's blindfolded head turned a fraction, registering the assist with something that might have been surprise. Didn't ask for backup, he said, though there was no real complaint in it. Didn't ask for permission, Strange said, gritting his teeth against the cost of holding the shield steady against a barrage this dense. Sukuna, watching two separate powers now actively coordinating against him, let out a short, humorless laugh through both mouths. How adorable, he said. Teamwork. And then the pressure around him spiked again, gathering toward something that made every instinct in Strange's body scream a warning even before Megumi's voice cracked out from behind the kiosk. Domain again. He's opening it wider this time. Get clear. The crimson dome of Malevolent Shrine tore open across the plaza a second time, vaster now than before, swallowing not just Sukuna's immediate vicinity, but the entire ruined intersection in one convulsive expansion. And Strange had exactly enough time to register, with grim professional respect, that this version of the domain was clearly built to close the exact escape route he'd exploited the first time, before the crimson infinity of turning blades closed over all three of them at once. He reached instinctively for the same trick, tear a portal straight up through the domain's fabric before the guaranteed hit could land, and felt, this time, the boundary fight back with an intelligence it hadn't shown before, Sukuna having clearly spent the intervening minutes reinforcing exactly the weakness Strange had found and exploited. The portal held for half the time it needed to. Strange threw himself through anyway, and the domain's edge closed on his trailing leg like a bear trap made of pure malevolent intent, a line of white-hot pain tearing up from his calf as he wrenched free, tumbling out into open air 20 feet above the plaza, with blood soaking fast through his tunic, and the cloak scrambling, urgent and alarmed in a way Strange had rarely felt from it, to slow his fall into something survivable. He hit the ground hard, rolled, came up on one knee with his injured leg screaming, and his reserves scraped down to something close to empty, and looked back to find Gojo still standing inside the collapsing dome of Malevolent Shrine, infinity somehow, impossibly, holding against an attack built specifically to guarantee a hit on anyone caught within its border. Blue light flickering at the edges of a barrier that refused, with a stubbornness that seemed to genuinely offend the domain's whole premise, to acknowledge that it had been struck at all. The dome finished collapsing back into Sukuna's raised hand a moment later, and the King of Curses stood in the wreckage of his own second attempt, staring at Gojo with an expression that had finally, unmistakably, curdled into something Strange recognized without needing a translation. The particular, ancient frustration of a being who had just been denied, twice in one night, by two different strangers, the one certainty he had built an entire terrifying reputation on. "You two," Sukuna said, low, and both mouths pulled back from his teeth in something that was no longer amusement at all. are becoming considerably less entertaining than I'd hoped. Gojo let the blue light of infinity fade from around his frame, with the unhurried ease of a man dismissing a minor inconvenience. Though strange, watching closely from where he knelt nursing his torn leg, caught the small, telling hitch in his breathing that suggested holding that barrier against a fully committed domain expansion had cost considerably more than the performance let on. "You know," Gojo said, rolling one shoulder. "Most people, after failing twice, take the hint." "Most people," Sukuna returned, "aren't me." But something in his stance had shifted, subtle and unmistakable, to anyone who'd spent the last quarter hour cataloging this creature's every tell. The loose, contemptuous ease was gone, replaced by the coiled stillness of a predator, recalculating whether the hunt was still worth the cost. His gaze slid sideways, toward Strange, then back toward Gojo, weighing something. "Two unknowns in one night," he said, half to himself. "One who doesn't smell like anything I've cataloged, and one who spent 2 years making my afternoons difficult. I find I'm suddenly less interested in proving a point, and more interested in seeing what the rest of this night has to offer." It should have sounded like a retreat. It didn't, quite. Strange had heard enough of this creature's voice by now to recognize that Sukuna did not retreat so much as reallocate, and the cold feeling settling into his stomach told him this recalculation was not going to be good news for someone. "Megumi," Sukuna added, almost idle, and the shift in his tone when he said the name, softer, almost fond, in a way that made Strange's skin crawl worse than any of the violence that had come before it, made every one of the 3 students behind the ruined kiosk go rigid. "I'll be borrowing this body a while longer. Your friends should get used to that." Then, to Gojo, with a small, mocking incline of his head, "Until next time, Satoru, try to make it more interesting." And he was simply gone. Not teleportation exactly. Strange's astral senses registered something closer to a fold in cursed energy itself, a technique adjacent to but distinct from Strange's own spatial folding, gone in a smear of crimson-black light that left the plaza's ruined center suddenly, eerily quiet except for rain hissing against still-smoking pavement. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Gojo exhaled, long and slow, and some of the eerie weightlessness went out of his posture, replaced by something more tired and more human. "Well," he said, "that was a lot of new information for one Tuesday." He turned toward Strange, blindfolded gaze tracking with that same unnerving precision. "You're bleeding pretty seriously, by the way. Might want to deal with that before you bleed out being mysterious at me." Strange looked down at his leg. The domain's parting bite had torn deeper than the adrenaline had let him register, blood soaking dark through the fabric, and reached for the small, careful healing working Wong had drilled into him 100 times over, enough to close the worst of it and buy time for proper treatment later. It cost him more than it should have. His reserves were scraped closer to empty than he wanted to admit to a stranger who'd just watched him nearly lose a fight with the strongest thing in this world. "I've had worse," he said, which was true, and didn't fully answer the concern in it, which was also true. Yuji, Nobara, and Megumi emerged from behind the ruined kiosk then, and Strange watched something pass between the 3 students and Gojo that he recognized instantly, even without knowing the specifics. The particular, wordless relief of people checking that their teacher was actually still alive, still actually them, after a night that had apparently given them ample reason to doubt both. "Sensei," Megumi said, and there was a rawness under the careful composure that told Strange plenty about what these 3 had already survived tonight, before he'd ever fallen out of the sky. "I'm fine," Gojo said. "Easy," though Strange noted he didn't quite meet the boy's eyes when he said it. "Banged up, nothing that hasn't happened before." He looked around at the wreckage of the plaza, and something harder settled into his voice. "Report. Fast version. What's the actual scope of tonight?" How many, where, and how bad? It was Nobara who answered, quick and precise in the manner of someone who'd clearly been rehearsing the report in her head through every terrified minute of the last hour, waiting for someone senior enough to give it to. Jogo still active somewhere to the northeast, having leveled a full city block in his hunt for Gojo before the diversion apparently worked too well. Mahito loose somewhere in the crowd, wearing faces, count unknown. Nanami's team had fallen back toward the east exit with wounded. No confirmed word yet from the Kyoto contingent that had been dispatched hours ago. And Sukuna had apparently fully surfaced sometime in the last 30 minutes, which meant whatever binding vow or curse technique had kept Megumi's body from being permanently overwritten was now, unmistakably, failing. Gojo listened to all of it with a stillness that Strange was beginning to understand was this man's version of controlled fury, and when Nobara finished, he was quiet for a long moment, doing math that Strange suspected had considerably higher stakes than anything visible in his casual posture. "Okay," Gojo said finally. "New plan. I need eyes on Jogo before he levels another block, and I need someone senior enough to actually hold a line if Mahito decides tonight's the night to get creative." His blindfolded gaze slid back to Strange, weighing something. "And I need to know a lot more about what you actually are, Doctor, because whatever just happened out there, Sukuna backing off from a fight without finishing it, has not happened in the 2 years I've been fighting him. Not once. I'd rather you had better news for me than you're the reason the world's oldest monster got cautious," Strange said, dry despite the exhaustion dragging at every limb. "But I understand the concern." "It's not concern," Gojo said, and for the first time that whole exchange, something in his easy, weightless tone, went genuinely serious, stripped down to something colder and more focused underneath. "It's an opportunity. Sukuna doesn't get cautious. If you're the reason he did, tonight, of all nights, I want to know if that's something we can use again. Because right now, in this city, tonight, we need every advantage we can get, and you just handed us one nobody expected to exist." Behind him, in the ruined plaza's smoking wreckage, something in the dark distance, north, toward the district Nobara had named, lit the low clouds up in a sudden, violent orange flare, and a heartbeat later, the ground itself shuddered with the distant, rolling boom of an explosion, large enough to feel through a quarter-mile of city. Gojo's head turned toward it, jaw tightening. "That'll be Jogo," he said, already moving. "Conversation continues after. Right now, we've got a city still burning." They moved north through Shibuya's wounded streets at a pace that strained even Strange's carefully rationed reserves. Gojo setting a brutal rhythm that the 3 students matched without complaint, despite hours of accumulated exhaustion. And Strange found himself, not for the first time that night, quietly recalibrating his estimate of what these teenagers had already survived before he'd ever fallen into their war. "You're limping," Gojo observed, not slowing blindfolded gaze, somehow still tracking Strange's gait with unsettling precision. "I'm managing," Strange said, which was true in the narrow, technical sense that he hadn't yet fallen over. "Manage faster. Jogo's whole thing is fire and scale. He doesn't do subtle, which means we'll have plenty of warning, but it also means by the time we get there, there might not be much city left to save." Gojo's tone stayed light, almost conversational, but Strange had spent enough of the night now cataloging this man's tells to recognize the genuine strain underneath it. A teacher doing arithmetic about how many students he could keep breathing tonight, and not liking any of the answers. The orange glow on the northern skyline had grown considerably by the time they cleared the last ruined intersection, resolving into a scene that made even Strange, veteran of a dozen dimensional catastrophes, slow his pace for one involuntary beat. An entire block reduced to cratered smoking rubble, buildings sheared off at odd angles as though some enormous hand had simply swept them aside, and at the center of it, rising out of a crater still glowing faint orange at its edges, a figure built like a man carved from cooling lava, cracks running molten and bright across a hide the color and texture of volcanic rock. "Jogo," Megumi said. Unnecessary confirmation. Voice tight. The volcanic curse turned at their approach with unhurried, terrible confidence, magma dripping in slow threads from the cracks along his forearms, and his gaze swept across the group, students, teacher, and the stranger in the red cloak, with an assessment Strange recognized instantly as the same predatory cataloging he'd already survived once tonight, just wearing a different, less ancient face. "Gojo," Jogo said, voice like stone grinding on stone. "I've been looking forward to this all night." "Flattering," Gojo said, already stepping forward, putting himself between the curse and his students with an ease that suggested this exact positioning was pure reflex by now. "Wish I could say the same. You've made a real mess of my city, you know. Someone's going to have to fill out a truly obscene amount of paperwork for this block." Jogo's cracked mouth split into something like a grin, magma glowing brighter in the fissure of it. "Paperwork's the least of your problems tonight, Sorcerer. Sukuna's finally free, the old order's cracking. And you," the molten gaze slid past Gojo, settling with sudden, sharpened interest on Strange. "You're the thing everyone's been talking about." The stranger who made the King of Curses hesitate. "Word travels fast," Strange said, wary, feeling the weight of that attention settle uncomfortably. "In this world, word travels at the speed of curses," Jogo said, "and curses talk to each other more than you'd think." He rolled one massive shoulder, magma cracking and resealing along the movement. "I don't actually care what you are, stranger. I care about proving something to Sukuna. And you happen to be standing between me and the sorcerer I actually came here to kill." The fight that followed was, mercifully, shorter and considerably less existentially terrifying than the one Strange had already survived. Not because Jogo was weak, Strange understood quickly, watching Gojo weave infinity to casually nullify a barrage of compressed fire that would have leveled a city block on its own, but because Gojo, unlike Sukuna, was not remotely interested in testing an unknown quantity. He simply ended things, efficient and merciless, closing the distance in that same eerie discontinuous blink, and driving a technique into Jogo's chest that Strange's astral senses parsed only as concentrated, absolute negation, a burst of blue-black force that didn't merely wound the volcanic curse, but seemed to unmake the specific cursed architecture holding him together. Jogo staggered, cracks spreading wide and fast across his frame, magma light dimming from bright orange toward a duller, failing red. He managed, something almost respectful in the rasp of it even as he began, visibly, to come apart at the seams. "Guess I picked the wrong night too." He didn't finish the sentence. What remained of him collapsed into ash and ember, scattering across the cratered rubble in a slow, drifting spray that the wind carried off toward the burning skyline. Gojo exhaled, rolling his shoulders, some of the tension easing out of his frame, though nowhere close to all of it. "One down," he said. "Mahito's still loose somewhere, and Sukuna's not done for the night. Not by a long shot." His blindfolded gaze found Strange again, considering. "You held your own out there. Didn't do much, but you didn't get anyone killed being useless, which some special-grade sorcerers can't manage on a good day." "High praise," Strange said, dry, though he understood the genuine weight underneath it. Understood, watching Gojo's easy posture and the careful way he was still subtly positioned between the fight's aftermath and his three students, that this man's approval was not casually given. It was Nanami Kento who found them next, emerging from the smoke at the head of a small, battered group, with the particular grim efficiency of a man who had clearly spent the last several hours doing triage under conditions no insurance policy could have anticipated. And the report he delivered, Wounded sorcerers gathered at the east exit. The Kyoto contingent finally arrived and holding a secondary perimeter, Mahito's location still unconfirmed. Casualty numbers climbing in a way his flat professional voice did not fully disguise the cost of, settled over the group like another kind of weight entirely. The war's true scale coming into focus in a way that made Strange understand, with growing and uncomfortable clarity, that the fight he'd already survived twice tonight was very far from finished, and that whatever role he'd fallen into in this city's worst night, he had not yet begun to see the full shape of what it would ask of him. They regrouped at the east exit, in the gray, ash-thick hour that Strange's body insisted was somewhere past midnight, though the barrier's poisoned sky made honest timekeeping impossible. The staging ground Nanami had established occupied what had once been a small plaza outside a shuttered department store, now converted into something between a field hospital and a war room. Sorcerers in torn uniforms, sitting slumped against overturned barriers, a handful working quiet. Careful healing techniques over the worst of the wounded, and at the center of it, Nanami himself, blonde hair matted with rain, and something darker, moving between clusters of exhausted people with the calm, exacting efficiency of a man who had clearly decided that falling apart was a luxury scheduled for after the crisis, not during it. He looked up as Gojo's group approached, and his gaze settled on Strange with the flat, assessing weight of a man doing rapid triage on a new variable he hadn't budgeted for. "This is the one everyone's talking about," Nanami said. "Not a question." "Stephen Strange," Gojo said, before Strange could answer for himself. "Sorcerer Supreme of some other world entirely, fell through a hole in the sky about 2 hours ago, and has since made Sukuna retreat from a fight for the first time in recorded history. So, you know, Tuesday." Nanami's expression didn't change, though something in the set of his jaw suggested he was doing careful, silent math about how much of that sentence he was willing to accept at face value. "And where is he now?" "Sukuna." "Gone," Megumi said, quiet, and something in the flatness of his voice made Nanami's gaze flick briefly toward him, with a concern the older sorcerer didn't voice aloud. "For now. He said he'd be back. Then we work with the time we have." Nanami turned, businesslike, addressing the gathered sorcerers with the particular clipped clarity Strange was already coming to associate with genuine competence under pressure. "Current status. Jogo confirmed eliminated. Mahito's position unknown. Last credible sighting was 40 minutes ago near the west corridor, wearing an unfamiliar face. Assume he's still hunting stragglers. The Kyoto contingent has secured the southern perimeter and is holding, but they're stretched thin, and I will not pretend the higher-ups' handling of tonight has inspired confidence." A pause, brief and precisely weighted. "We are, in plain terms, still losing. We've bought time. We have not won anything." The honesty of it landed hard across the gathered group, and Strange, watching faces he'd known for barely 2 hours, absorbed that particular flavor of grim clarity, understood something about this world's culture, in that moment, that no amount of raw power on display had yet taught him. These people did not deal in false comfort, even for the young ones among them, even in the aftermath of a fight that had already cost them more than any of them were saying aloud. It was Maki Zenin. Strange placed the name from an introduction offered in the chaos of the regroup, sharp-eyed, ponytailed, carrying herself with the coiled economy of someone who'd fought her way through several times her body weight in curses that night. Who spoke next, voice hard with a fatigue that had nowhere left to hide. "The higher-ups' handling of tonight," she said, "was locking 100,000 civilians in a barrier with 3 special-grade curses and calling it a controlled engagement. Forgive me if I don't hold my breath for their next brilliant decision." "Maki," Nanami said, not sharply, but with the particular weight of a man choosing which battles to have room for tonight, and deciding this wasn't one of them. "I'm not wrong," she said, "and everyone standing here knows it. Strange found himself watching this exchange with the specific, uncomfortable attention of an outsider recognizing a fracture line he hadn't yet fully understood the shape of. Some deeper political rot beneath the surface of this crisis, something these people had clearly been navigating long before tonight, something his own presence had not caused and could not, he suspected, entirely fix. "She's not wrong," Nanami said finally, quiet, to the group at large, an admission that cost him something visible to give. "But recrimination doesn't save the people still inside this barrier. We work the problem in front of us." His gaze found Strange again, and this time there was something more direct in it, a professional's willingness to use an unproven resource, because the alternative was worse. "Doctor, whatever you are, whatever you can do, Gojo tells me you made Sukuna retreat. I need to know precisely what that means for the rest of the night, and I need to know it without embellishment, because embellishment gets people killed." Strange considered the question with the weight it deserved, aware of every exhausted face turned toward him now, aware that his answer would shape decisions about who lived and who didn't, for however many hours remained, until this barrier finally broke. "It means," he said carefully, "that my magic runs on a current he wasn't prepared for, and that unpreparedness cost him more than he expected to pay. It does not mean I can beat him outright. I came closer to dying in that fight than I have in a very long time, and I suspect the only reason I'm standing here at all is that he was curious rather than committed. If he decides tonight that killing me matters more than studying me, I don't know that the outcome looks the same twice." The honesty of it settled over the group heavier than any comforting lie would have, and Strange watched Nanami absorb it with the flat, professional respect of a man who'd clearly been hoping for better news, and had gotten, instead, something he could actually plan around. "Then we don't rely on you to solve Sukuna," Nanami said. "We rely on you where you're actually useful. And right now, that's helping secure this perimeter and cover ground we're currently too thin to hold ourselves." He turned, already redirecting his attention to the wounded, to the map someone had sketched crude, and hurried across a torn piece of cardboard, to the 100 smaller crises that made up the shape of a war too large for any single hero to carry alone. "Rest what you can. 10 minutes. Then we move. Mahito isn't going to stop hunting just because we're tired." Strange sank down against the cold stone of a shattered barrier, the 10 minutes grace settling over aching muscles like a mercy he hadn't expected this world to offer, and found the cloak wrapping itself close around his shoulders, a small, wordless gesture of the same steady loyalty it had shown him across a dozen worse nights than this one. And for the first time since the tear had thrown him into this catastrophe, he allowed himself to wonder, with the particular cold clarity that came only in the brief quiet between disasters, exactly how many more hours like this one this city, and everyone still breathing inside it, actually had left in them. Continue. The 10 minutes grace lasted, in the end, closer to 6. Which Strange was coming to understand was simply the tax this night charged on every plan anyone dared to make. The interruption came in the form of a scream, not the ambient, ongoing horror noise of a city under siege, which had become almost background by now, but a single, sharp, specific cry from somewhere close, near enough that half the exhausted sorcerers scattered across the staging ground were on their feet before the sound had finished echoing off the ruined storefronts. Nanami was moving before Strange had fully processed what he'd heard, already calling out directions with the same clipped precision he'd used to organize the group minutes earlier, and Strange found himself falling into step alongside Yuji and Nobara as the group split, half holding the staging ground, half converging on the sound. They found the source in the gutted shell of a convenience store 2 blocks over. A wounded sorcerer, young, no older than the students Strange had spent the last several hours fighting beside, pinned against a collapsed shelving unit by something that had, until a moment ago, apparently been a colleague. Mahito stood over the scene with an expression of open, delighted curiosity that Strange found, on some visceral level, considerably more unsettling than anything Sukuna's ancient contempt had produced. Patchworked pale skin, wide unnatural grin, the specific unhurried cruelty of something that had never once in its existence needed to hurry for anyone. Examining the wounded sorcerer's twisted, half-reformed features with the clinical interest of a sculptor, assessing an unfinished work. "Oh good," Mahito said, not looking up. "An audience. I do love an audience." He tilted his head, considering the ruined shape of what had recently been a person's face. Cursed technique still visibly working through the flesh, reshaping it in slow, horrific increments. "I'm still working out the aesthetics on this one. Souls are so much more interesting to sculpt than bodies. You'd think people would appreciate the artistry more." Strange felt something in his chest go cold and precise, in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the specific, clarifying fury he reserved for cruelty performed as entertainment. He had met versions of this creature before, in other dimensions, wearing other faces, and had learned, across every one of those encounters, that hesitation in front of something that considered suffering an art form only ever cost more lives than decisive action. "That's quite enough of that," he said, and didn't wait for a response before he moved, the cloak already surging him forward in a burst of speed that closed the distance before Mahito's grin had finished registering the interruption. Mahito's reaction, when it came, was fast, inhumanly, unnervingly fast, a hand already reshaping into something with too many joints reaching to intercept. But Strange had spent the last several hours learning, at considerable personal cost, exactly how to read the specific rhythm of a cursed technique's telegraph, and he folded space a half-second before contact, appearing behind Mahito with the wounded sorcerer already half-carried clear in a working of pure raw force he hadn't fully planned but executed anyway, driven by instinct honed across 15 years of exactly this kind of triage. "Interesting," Mahito said, turning unhurried to face him, delight undimmed by the interruption. "Another new toy. Sukuna's been talking about you all night, you know." "Well, not talking. He doesn't really do that. But I can feel it. The way the air's been different since you fell into our little war. You're not cursed energy. You're not soul at all, actually, are you?" Something sharpened in that patchwork face. Genuine fascination replacing the earlier idle cruelty. "I wonder what happens if I touch you." "I'd strongly recommend against finding out," Strange said, already gathering the Vishanti's current into both hands, wary now in a specific, different way than he'd been wary of Sukuna. Sukuna's danger had been raw, overwhelming force. This creature's danger, he suspected, lived somewhere considerably more insidious. He learned exactly how insidious a moment later, when Mahito lunged and Strange, still favoring his torn leg, folded space a fraction slower than he'd intended, and the curse's outstretched hand brushed, for the barest fraction of a second, against the edge of his sleeve. Nothing happened. Strange felt it not happen with a kind of retroactive dread, watching Mahito's expression flicker, for the first time all night, into something genuinely startled. "Huh," Mahito said, drawing his hand back sharply, staring at his own fingers with an expression Strange recognized, having seen its cousin cross Sukuna's face hours earlier, as a predator's plans quietly, comprehensively failing. "That should have worked. That always works. I touch something. I know its soul. I remake it into whatever I want it to be." He flexed his fingers, and something almost like genuine offense crept into his voice. "You don't have one. Not one I can touch anyway. What are you?" "Something your technique wasn't built to account for, apparently," Strange said, and pressed the advantage while the creature was still visibly recalibrating, driving a controlled burst of the winds of Watum directly into Mahito's chest. Not enough to end things outright, He understood already that this creature's regenerative and reconstructive nature would make a clean kill considerably harder than it looked, but enough to throw him bodily through the remaining wall of the gutted convenience store, in a spray of concrete dust and twisted rebar. Mahito came up from the wreckage laughing, delighted rather than deterred, already reshaping the torn edge of his own patchwork skin back into something whole. "Oh, I like this," he said. "Sukuna gets the interesting stranger who nearly kills him, and I get the interesting stranger my technique can't even touch. This is turning into a genuinely wonderful night." He rolled his shoulders, cursed energy gathering thick and eager around his reforming hands. "Let's see how many other things about you don't work the way you expect." Behind Strange, Yuji had reached the wounded sorcerer and was hauling him clear with Nobara's help, and something in the boy's face as he glanced up at Mahito, a specific, complicated tightness that went beyond the general dread everyone here seemed to carry toward this particular curse, told Strange there was history here he didn't yet understand. Some old and personal wound this creature had already carved into at least one of the people he'd spent the night fighting beside. He filed the question away for later, because Mahito was already moving again, and the fight that followed left no room for anything but survival. The fight with Mahito was, Strange would reflect later in the rare moments the night allowed for reflection, the strangest of the three he'd survived so far. Not because the creature was more powerful than Sukuna, it plainly wasn't, but because it fought with none of the King of Curse's overwhelming directness, preferring instead a patient, probing cruelty that treated the entire engagement as a kind of ongoing experiment, testing angles, testing reactions, delighted by failure almost as much as it would have been by success. "You fold space," Mahito observed, dodging a fresh burst of the winds of Watum, by simply reshaping his own torso around the blast, in a way that made Strange's stomach turn. "But not infinitely. There's a cost, isn't there? I can see it in how you're favoring that leg, how your hands shake a little more each time. You're not inexhaustible. That's useful information." He tilted his head, considering. "Sukuna will want to know that. I'll be sure to tell him, assuming you don't kill me first, which, no offense, seems increasingly unlikely given how tired you look." "I've survived worse odds than this," Strange said, though the honest truth beneath the composure was that Mahito's assessment wasn't wrong. His reserves, already scraped thin by the fight with Sukuna and the running battle that had followed, were beginning to fray at the edges, in a way that worried him considerably more than he let show. It was Yuji who changed the shape of the fight, stepping in beside Strange with a coiled, furious readiness that hadn't been present in any of his earlier engagements that night, a personal weight to it that Strange still didn't fully understand the source of, though he was beginning to suspect, watching the boy's jaw set hard as Mahito's patchwork grin swung toward him, that this particular curse had cost Yuji something the others hadn't. "You remember me," Yuji said, low, and it wasn't a question. "Of course I remember you," Mahito said, and something in his voice shifted, the idle scientific curiosity sharpening into something with real appetite behind it. "You're the interesting one, the one who did something to my hand that shouldn't have been possible either. Small world. Tonight, everyone's full of surprises." Whatever history lived between them, Strange understood in that moment that it wasn't his to ask about mid-battle, and instead used the opening Yuji's sudden focused fury created, weaving a binding working reinforced this time with lessons learned from every failure of the night so far. Not trying to hold Mahito with force alone, but layering the binding with a corrosive edge borrowed from the vapors of Valtor, hoping the same partial purchase he'd found against Sukuna's regeneration might find similar traction here. It worked. Marginally. The binding held for nearly 3 full seconds, Mahito's reforming flesh visibly straining against threads of golden corrosive light, long enough for Yuji to close the distance, and drive a strike into the creature's chest with a force that Strange's astral senses flagged, in the instant of impact, as carrying something far beyond ordinary human strength, something with a texture and weight that didn't belong to any technique Strange had yet catalogued that night. Mahito came apart in a spray of black-red matter that reformed almost instantly, but the pained, genuine surprise on what remained of his patchwork face told Strange the strike had cost him something real. "That's new," Mahito said, echoing, without apparent awareness of the irony, the exact words Sukuna had used hours earlier, and there was something almost admiring in it even through the pain. "You've gotten stronger since we last talked, Itadori. I should be worried about that. I find I'm mostly just curious." He flexed his reforming hand, testing it, and something in his posture shifted, recalculating. "But curiosity isn't the same as suicide. And two of you working together, tonight, with whatever that stranger's doing to my reconstruction, that's a worse math problem than I feel like solving right now." He didn't wait for a counter. He simply folded himself sideways into a nearby patch of shadow with a fluidity that made Strange's skin crawl, the whole grotesque shape of him compressing and vanishing into darkness that no light seemed able to fully reach, and was gone, leaving only a faint, lingering wrongness in the air where he'd stood. Yuji stood breathing hard in the settling quiet, fists still clenched, something raw and unresolved still working across his face. "He'll be back," Yuji said, quiet, more to himself than to Strange. "He always comes back." "I gathered that's a theme tonight," Strange said, gentler than his exhaustion strictly allowed for, recognizing something in the boy's expression that went beyond ordinary battle fatigue. "An old wound, freshly reopened. Whatever happened between you two before tonight, you don't have to tell me. But you fought like someone with a reason bigger than duty back there, and I've learned, across a considerable number of worlds, that reasons like that are usually worth trusting." Yuji didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had gone quieter, stripped of the easy readiness he'd carried through most of the night. "He killed someone," he said. "Someone who mattered. Used her like she was material. Like she wasn't a person at all." He looked at the space where Mahito had vanished, jaw tight. "I keep telling myself I'll be strong enough next time. Tonight I almost was." Strange said nothing for a moment, letting the honesty of it sit in the space between them without rushing to smooth it over with easy comfort neither of them had earned yet. "Almost," he said finally, "is more than most people manage against something like that on their first real try. Hold on to it. It'll matter next time." Then, glancing back toward the direction of the staging ground, aware of the wounded sorcerer Nobara had already begun carrying clear, aware of the night's relentless, unforgiving arithmetic still counting down around them. "For now, though, I think we've bought what quiet this city's going to offer us tonight. Let's not waste it." They made their way back through the smoke together, and Strange found himself thinking, as they walked, that whatever else this catastrophic, impossible night had cost him, it had also handed him something he hadn't expected to find falling through a tear in reality. The beginnings of an understanding, hard-won and still incomplete, of exactly what these people were fighting for, and exactly how much it was already costing every one of them to keep fighting for it. They returned to find the staging ground transformed by a different kind of crisis. Not curses this time, but politics. The particular ugly arithmetic of institutions trying to manage a catastrophe they hadn't planned for and didn't fully understand. A woman Strange didn't recognize stood at the center of a tense cluster of sorcerers, dressed in the formal dark robes that marked her. Strange gathered quickly from the tone of the conversation, rather than any introduction, as one of the Jujutsu world's higher-ups, someone with authority that outranked even Gojo's considerable reputation, and who was, at this exact moment, being met with a wall of barely restrained hostility from nearly everyone gathered. "Which means," the woman was saying, voice clipped and cold, The official position remains containment, not rescue. The barrier holds until the situation inside is fully neutralized, and I remind everyone present that the higher-ups authorized this engagement with full knowledge of the civilian cost, because the alternative, Sukuna loose in an uncontained city, was judged categorically worse. The civilians are still inside the barrier, Maki said, flat, dangerous. You're talking about them like they're already a rounding error. I'm talking about them like a sorcerer who understands triage, the woman returned, unmoved. You want to argue policy? Argue it after tonight is over. Right now I need confirmation that the containment is holding, and I need to know why a foreign combatant with no vetting, no clan affiliation, and no known allegiance is currently operating inside an active special-grade engagement. Her gaze found strange as she said it, and the temperature of the whole conversation shifted, sharpened. Every eye in the staging ground suddenly weighing him with a wariness that had nothing to do with curses, and everything to do with the specific, ancient suspicion institutions reserved for anything they couldn't yet categorize, control, or claim. He's the reason Sukuna's still alive to be a problem tomorrow instead of tonight, Gojo said, stepping in with a lazy, deceptively casual ease that didn't fully mask the edge underneath it. You're welcome, by the way. That's precisely my concern, the woman said. An unvetted, unaffiliated variable, powerful enough to make Sukuna hesitate, is not automatically good news, Gojo. It's a second unknown threat we now have to account for, on top of the ones we already had. Strange felt the weight of that assessment land with the particular sting of being reduced, in the space of one sentence, from an ally who'd bled for these people's city, to a liability requiring a policy response. And understood, watching the flicker of quiet, unhappy agreement pass across a few of the more institutionally minded sorcerers' faces, that this was not merely one woman's paranoia. This was the actual architecture of the world he'd fallen into, an old, tired hierarchy that had survived 1,000 years by treating every unquantified variable as a threat first, and an asset only provisionally, if ever. With respect, Strange said, keeping his voice level though something old and stubborn in him bristled at being spoken about rather than to. I understand the instinct to be cautious about an unknown. I've built entire protocols around exactly that instinct, in my own world, more than once. But I'd remind you that in the last several hours, this unknown variable has fought your king of curses to a standstill. Kept a colleague of yours from having his soul reshaped into whatever a curse named Mahito considered art, and asked nothing from any of you in return, except the chance to help. If suspicion is the price of that, I'll pay it. But I'd rather you spent the energy on the things still trying to kill everyone in this barrier. A silence followed that Strange couldn't quite read. Not agreement exactly, but something that had shifted, marginally, in the room's temperature. It was Nanami, of all people, who broke it. Voice quiet but carrying the particular weight of a man whose measured judgment the room had already learned to trust that night. For what it's worth, he said, I watched him carry a wounded sorcerer clear of Mahito with his own body between them and the strike. I don't need a clan affiliation to know what that means. The higher-up's expression didn't soften exactly, but something in her posture conceded the point without conceding the argument. Noted, she said. The policy stands regardless, containment first, and the foreign combatant remains a flagged variable pending further assessment. But I won't pretend tonight's numbers would look better without him in the field. She turned, already moving toward the next crisis demanding her attention. The conversation closed with the particular finality of someone who had 100 other fires to manage, and no patience left for this one. Get back to your positions. All of you. The barrier isn't holding itself. The group dispersed slowly, the tension of the exchange lingering even as people returned to the grim, practical business of triage and readiness. and Strange found Megumi lingering nearby, watching him with an expression that had shifted, subtly, since the earlier hours of the night. "Don't take it personally," Megumi said, quiet. "That's just how the higher-ups are. Everything's a liability, until it's proven useful enough to be worth the risk of trusting. It's not really about you. I've met institutions like that before," Strange said. "In my own world, no less. I confess I'd hoped, foolishly, that falling through a hole in reality might have spared me the experience at least once, something that might, on a less guarded face, have been the beginning of a real smile crossed Megumi's expression. "No such luck," he said. "Welcome to the Jujutsu world." Strange found himself, despite the ache in every limb and the grim arithmetic of a night nowhere near finished, almost laughing, a small, tired, genuine sound that felt strange in his own throat after hours of nothing but violence and dread. "I begin to suspect," he said, "that the Jujutsu world and my own have considerably more in common than either of us would probably like to admit." The moment of quiet didn't last. Somewhere to the south, past the perimeter the Kyoto contingent had been struggling to hold, a new pressure began building in the ash-thick air. Not the volcanic violence of Jogo, not the probing cruelty of Mahito, but something older and stranger, a slow, deliberate gathering that made even Gojo's easy posture go suddenly, completely still. "That's not one of tonight's usual suspects," Gojo said, blindfolded gaze fixed on the southern horizon, and for the first time since Strange had met him, real uncertainty threaded through the careful lightness of his voice. "That's something new." The pressure resolved, over the several tense minutes it took the group to reach the southern perimeter, into a figure Strange hadn't yet encountered that night. Long dark hair, calm composed features, utterly incongruous with the chaos surrounding him, white and navy robes untouched by the ash and blood staining everything else in the barrier, standing at the center of the Kyoto contingent's broken line with the serene, unhurried patience of a man who had arrived not to fight, but to observe. "Kenjaku," Megumi said, and the name carried a weight in his voice that told Strange this was someone whose reputation preceded him, even among people who'd already survived Sukuna and Mahito in a single night. The Kyoto sorcerers scattered around the perimeter's edge bore the marks of a fight that had clearly gone badly before their arrival, not the raw carnage of a straightforward battle, Strange noted with growing unease as he took in the scene, but something more surgical, more deliberate, several of the fallen showing wounds that looked less like combat injuries and more like the aftermath of careful, curious experimentation. "Ah," Kenjaku said, turning at their approach with an expression of mild, scholarly interest that Strange found, if anything, more unsettling than any of the night's more overt monstrosity. "Satoru Gojo." And the calm gaze slid past Gojo, settling on Strange with an attention that felt uncomfortably clinical, like a specimen being catalogued. "The stranger everyone's been talking about all evening. I confess I came south specifically hoping to get a look at you myself." "You'll forgive me for not being flattered," Strange said, wary, reading the same patient, probing quality in this creature's stillness that he'd learned to fear in Mahito's idle cruelty, though wrapped here in something considerably more composed and, he suspected, considerably more dangerous for its composure. "I collect interesting things," Kenjaku said, unbothered. "Bodies, techniques, curiosities the world doesn't yet have a name for. 1,000 years of collecting teaches you to recognize when something genuinely new has entered the field. And you, Doctor, word does travel, are the first genuinely new thing I've encountered in longer than I care to admit." He tilted his head, considering. "I don't intend to fight you tonight. I have neither the numbers nor, frankly, the interest in dying to find out what you're capable of on Sukuna's estimation alone. But I did want to see you myself, and I wanted you to understand something before this war continues any further." "And what's that?" Gojo said, flat, already angling his body between Kenjaku and the students without appearing to move much at all. That tonight is not the whole of the story, Kenjaku said, and something in his calm, composed voice sharpened, just slightly, into something with real weight behind it. Sukuna surfacing, the culling game already in motion behind the scenes. The old order cracking under pressure it was never built to survive. This has been coming for a very long time, and a stranger falling out of the sky, however powerful, does not change the shape of what's already in motion. I'd advise against believing you've stumbled into someone else's isolated crisis, Doctor. You've stumbled into the opening act of something considerably larger, and I suspect before this is finished, you'll have to decide how large a part you're willing to play in it. The words landed with a specific, cold clarity that made Strange's exhaustion momentarily recede beneath something more focused. The particular attention he reserved for genuine strategic threats rather than merely violent ones. And he understood, watching Kenjaku's calm, patient face, that whatever this creature was, it operated on a timescale, and with an intelligence that made even Sukuna's ancient malice feel, by comparison, almost straightforward. Is that a threat? Strange asked. Or an invitation? Neither, Kenjaku said, and something that might have been genuine amusement crossed his composed features. An observation, freely given, because I find I enjoy watching intelligent things make informed choices, rather than blind ones. What you do with it is entirely your own business. He glanced once, almost idle, at the wounded Kyoto sorcerers scattered around him. I've gathered what I came for tonight. I won't trouble you further. And then, without any further ceremony, without the violent theatrics that had marked every other departure Strange had witnessed that night, he simply turned and walked into the smoke, unhurried, and was gone. The silence that followed carried a different weight than any that had come before it. Not the raw relief of surviving an immediate threat, but something colder and more unsettling. The specific dread of having glimpsed, briefly, the outline of a much larger and more patient danger than any single night's crisis could contain. He's never that direct, Megumi said quietly, staring at the space where Kenjaku had vanished. Never. He doesn't talk to people he considers threats. He studies them. Which means, Gojo said, and the easy lightness had gone entirely out of his voice now, replaced by something Strange hadn't yet heard from him. Genuine, focused concern. He's already decided you're worth studying, Doctor. And I promise you, whatever plans that man's been running for longer than any of us have been alive, being on his radar is not a good place to be standing. Strange looked out at the ash-thick smoke where Kenjaku had disappeared, felt the cloak tighten faintly and protectively around his shoulders, and thought of the tear that had thrown him into this world in the first place. A wound in reality opened by pure accident, colliding with another wound opened by design, on a night when it was becoming increasingly clear the entire architecture of this world's fragile peace had already been quietly, patiently coming apart for far longer than one catastrophic evening could explain. Then I suppose, he said, I'd better find out exactly what I've fallen into before it finishes deciding what to do with me. Behind them, the barrier's poisoned sky pulsed once, deep and slow, crimson threading again through the black, and somewhere close, unmistakable even at a distance, the particular pressure of Sukuna's presence began, patient and unhurried, to gather itself once more. The pull toward Sukuna's presence didn't come as a summons so much as an inevitability, the way a held breath eventually gives itself back to the lungs, and Strange, walking toward it with the last reserves of a body that had been running on fumes for hours, understood with grim clarity that whatever this final confrontation held, it would be decided by whatever he had left, rather than whatever he wished he still had. They found him in the station's ruined heart, standing amid wreckage that had once been the central concourse, Megumi's borrowed body wreathed in a crimson-black pressure that had thickened, over the course of the night, into something that felt less like power held in reserve, and more like power that had simply stopped bothering to hide how much of it there was. "You came back," Sukuna said, and something in his ancient, ruined voice had shifted since their last meeting. Less curiosity now, more the flat, considering weight of a predator who had spent the intervening hours doing careful arithmetic. "I wondered if you would. Most things that survive me the first time have the sense to run." "I've never been particularly good at running," Strange said, and felt Gojo settle in beside him, felt the three students fan out at his flanks with the tired, determined readiness of people who had already given everything tonight and intended to give whatever remained. "Good," Sukuna said, and both mouths curved into something that was no longer amusement, had stopped being amusement several hours and several deaths ago. "Because I've decided something, stranger. I've decided you're not a curiosity anymore. You're a variable I don't understand in a game I intend to win, and I've lived 1,000 years specifically by never leaving variables like that unresolved." The pressure around him gathered, vast and patient, the crimson threading through the ruined station's shattered windows like something alive. "So let's finish what we started, properly this time. No more testing, no more curiosity, just you and me, and whatever's left standing when the sky stops bleeding." What followed was, by any measure Strange could construct, the hardest fight of his life. Not merely because Sukuna fought now with none of his earlier contemptuous restraint, throwing every ounce of a millennium's accumulated mastery into an assault that tested every scrap of craft Strange had ever learned across 15 years and a dozen dimensions, but because this time he did not fight it alone. Gojo's infinity carved impossible angles out of Sukuna's fastest strikes. Yuji's raw, furious strength landed blows that would have staggered lesser curses outright. Megumi's Shikigami harried and distracted at the fight's edges, even as the boy fought the specific, private horror of watching his own body wielded as a weapon against people he cared about. Nobara's precise, vicious technique found openings no one else could have seen. And Strange, weaving corrosive workings layered now with lessons hard-won across every failure of the long night, found, slowly, expensively, at a cost that left his hands shaking and his vision swimming with exhaustion, that persistence where raw power alone had failed was beginning, incrementally, to matter. Not a single overwhelming blow. 100 small ones, accumulating faster than even Sukuna's monstrous regeneration could fully erase. The King of Curses felt it too. Strange watched it register across that ancient, ruined face, somewhere past the fight's 20th minute. Not fear, still not fear, but something that had finally, grudgingly, become respect. "Enough," Sukuna said finally, breathing hard himself now, wounds closing slower than they had at the fight's start, both mouths pulled into a thin, considering line. "This isn't a night I finish you on. I'll grant you that much, stranger. You've earned a longer story than tonight." He straightened, the crimson pressure around him drawing inward, banking rather than extinguishing. "But understand this. Whatever you are, wherever you came from, you've made yourself part of this world's story now. I don't forget names. And I especially don't forget the ones that make me work this hard." A final, unreadable glance passed between them, something that might, on a kinder creature, have carried the shape of genuine acknowledgement. "Until next time, Sorcerer Supreme." And then, in a smear of crimson-black light, he was gone. Not defeated. Strange understood clearly, even through the bone-deep exhaustion dragging at every limb. But withdrawn. A war postponed rather than won. The same terrible patience Kenjaku had warned them of settling back over the ruined station, like a held breath finally, temporarily, released. Silence fell across the wreckage. Rain, thinning now toward dawn, fell through a sky that had, for the first time in hours, stopped bleeding crimson at its edges. Gojo let out a long, unsteady breath, and sank down onto a piece of shattered concrete with none of his earlier weightless ease, looking, for the first time all night, simply exhausted, simply human. "Well," he said, "that happened." "Understatement of the century," Yuji managed, dropping down beside him, and something in the small, tired laugh that followed carried the specific relief of people who had genuinely not expected to see the sun again. Strange looked around at the ruined station, at the 4 exhausted, battered people who had, in the space of one impossible night, become something he hadn't expected to find on the far side of a catastrophic accident. Allies, however provisional, in a war that was very clearly nowhere near finished, in a world that had asked more of him in a single evening than some entire dimensions had across years. The tear that had thrown him here was gone, sealed shut or simply spent, and he understood, with the particular clarity that came only after surviving something that should have killed him, that he had no clear way home, and no clear sense yet of how long this world's war would need him before it let him look for one. The cloak settled warm and steady around his shoulders, and somewhere past the ruined skyline, faint and gray and entirely undeserved, the first true light of dawn began, finally, to break over Shibuya. Dawn broke over Shibuya slow and reluctant, gray light climbing over a skyline that had been remade overnight into something the city's survivors would spend years learning to rebuild, not just the shattered concrete and torn steel, but the deeper architecture underneath it, the fragile, aging order that had governed the Jujutsu world for 1,000 years, and had, in the space of one impossible night, cracked wide enough for everyone still standing to see clean through to its rot. Stephen Strange stood at the edge of the barrier's fading boundary as it finally, gratefully dissolved, watching 100,000 civilians stumble blinking into a morning none of them would fully understand, and felt the full weight of the night finally settle into muscles that had earned every ache twice over. Beside him, Gojo, Nanami, and the 3 students he'd fought beside stood in the same exhausted silence. People who had given a war everything they had, and had, against every reasonable expectation, lived to see the other side of it. He had come through a tear in reality chasing a crisis that had nothing to do with this place, and had found instead a war he understood only in fragments, an ancient monster who had learned, grudgingly, to respect him. A brilliant, weightless sorcerer, already recalculating how to use an unexpected ally. A patient, collecting intelligence that had marked him as worth watching. 3 young people who had shown him, across one impossible night, exactly what courage looked like when it had nowhere left to retreat to. There would be more nights like this one. He understood that with the particular, unhurried certainty of a man who had learned, across 15 years of his own world's crises, that no single victory ever closed a war outright, that Kenjaku's warning had been honest, that Sukuna's promise to remember his name had been a threat, and an invitation both, that whatever door had torn open to drop him here, remained, for now, firmly and inexplicably shut behind him. But for one gray, undeserved morning, the sky over Shibuya had stopped bleeding, and the people who had bled to make that happen were still, against every terrible odds the night had thrown at them, breathing. Stephen Strange, Sorcerer Supreme of a world very far away, looked out over a city he had never meant to save, and understood, with quiet and unshakable certainty, that he was not going anywhere until this one was finished being saved properly. The cloak settled closer around his shoulders, steady as it had ever been across 100 worse mornings than this. And somewhere behind him, Yuji Itadori laughed, small, tired, and entirely real, at something Nobara had said, and for just a moment, that sound alone was worth every hour of the night that had come before it.